All right, so let's get underway. For many of you, of course, our first invited speaker will need no introduction. Bill deVries is, of course, a renowned Sellars scholar who has published extensively on both Hegel and Sellars. Many of you are no doubt familiar with this excellent book, Wilfrid Sellars in the Philosophy Now series. He has also published with his colleague Tim Triplett a fine commentary on empiricism and the philosophy of mind, and of course, many other works too numerous to list in this introduction. He also co-edits with Henry Jackman the series Routledge Studies in American Philosophy until his recent retirement, which he has just reminded us of. He was professor of philosophy at the University of New Hampshire. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Bill, who will be presenting a paper titled Persons and Their Categories.
Well, thank you very much. I thank you all for being here. I must admit, I really do wish we'd had the opportunity to gather in person. I'd like to, share a beer with you afterwards and get to know more of you than I already know. So that's a regret, but you can't always get what you want, as one great philosopher has pointed out. So I'm going to share my screen once I get my screen in the right shape. This, and now do that. All right, so are we good now? You can see my screen, persons in their categories.
We are good.
All right, so detailed engagement with Sellars' ethics as such requires a sophistication in the field that I cannot lay claim to. Ethics has not been my métier. Luckily, Sellars was greatly occupied with the metaphysics of practice and agency, and that's the topics I've done some more thinking about. So today, I hope to be a bit less abstract than I have been and say something that speaks more to our current situation. Let's call it an exercise in the applied metaphysics of practice. My presentation, the slides are not much. They're just pretty much the quotations I've used from Sellars because, as we all know, Sellars is hard to listen to and he's hard enough to read. So first section is the disunity of the images. I have to start, however, with Sellars' distinction between the manifest and the scientific images to set my context. Both conceptions are ideal types, and both involve a very high level of abstraction from the nitty-gritty particularities of the lived world and of science. Some believe that Sellars gets into trouble by assuming a strong unity of science, even though he explicitly provides for methodological and linguistic differences among various sciences. He seems to have no problem with the very reductive treatment of the objects of all the sciences, at least up to the objects of the science of sentient beings. Sentience gives his reductionism pause. With respect to the normatively balanced phenomena of human life, he tries to pull off a delicate balancing act. Norms, values, and associated phenomena are double-tracked. Qua empirical phenomena occurring in space and time, they are reducible, as he says, causally reducible. In their normative guise, however, no reduction, that is, no conceptual reduction, can be carried out. To the extent that the sciences are concerned with objects that are, in a strict sense, empirically described, reducibility reigns and unifies the sciences. Now, lately, philosophers such as Cartwright, Dupre, and Galison have argued that science is less unified than the positivists, and even many post-positivists have believed. If Sellars had been more sensitive to the disunity of science, he might not have thought that the scientific image stood as such a sharp all or nothing challenge to the manifest image, able to replace it more or less wholesale. But I'm interested in flipping that question. How unified, then, is the manifest image? Remember how Sellars introduces the manifest image. Here we go to, there we go. The manifest image of man in the world is, first, the framework in terms of which man came to be aware of himself as man in the world. It is the framework in terms of which, to use an existentialist turn of phrase, man first encountered himself, which is, of course, when he became man. For it is no merely incidental feature of man that he has a conception of himself as man in the world, just as it is obvious on reflection that, quote, if man had a radically different conception of himself, he would be a radically different kind of man. So the most fundamental problem in philosophy is understanding how we human beings hang together with everything else. To paraphrase the immortal Walt Kelly, we have met the problem and he is us. Kant boils philosophy down to four questions, the first three of which are what can I know, what ought I do, what can I hope, and then insists that the most important is the fourth, what is man? Forgiving Kant, and for that matter, Sellars for a moment, the non-PC formulations in terms of man rather than humanity, it remains the case that when philosophy forgets the priority of this question, it is headed for trouble. Now, Sellars' initial quasi-historical description of the manifest image might encourage the notion that as the vehicle of our first self-awareness, it is a one-time affair, and once established, not subject to further change. But Sellars is also very clear that the manifest image has been subject to refinement and to sophistication, both empirical and categorial. It is not a musty historical artifact, but a vibrant, changing instrument with which we cope with the world. How then do we understand the nature of change in the manifest image? The scientific image seems to have a clear teleology in Sellars' view. It is not only an ideal type, but it aims at, in a different sense, an ideal theory. Is there such an ideal in the manifest image? The manifest image shares the epistemological goals of the scientific image. But insofar as the manifest image is the framework we have been more or less caused to have by encountering the world and becoming evolutionarily well-tuned to survive, and in our case, this is survive without a particular environmental niche, it does not seem to possess any telos beyond the evolutionary ideal of keeping us alive long enough to reproduce. Now, evolution is notoriously a satisficer and not an optimizer. And that might indicate that there is no particular ideal towards which the manifest image is pointed. Aren't at least some of the recent changes in the manifest image more than causal upshots of our purely natural selection, however? Haven't we made some progress towards refining the manifest image rationally and with explicit aims to improve both its epistemic and its practical structure? I propose to investigate here the lines along which the manifest image might fracture and what such disunity might explain. So my second section is titled Frameworks, Categories, and Basic Objects. Significant differences within or between conceptual frameworks seem to come down to differences in the categories used. Merely empirical disagreements do not mark major distinctions between frameworks. So then the question is, what is a category? Now, Sellars actually never gives us a very clear set of criteria for saying that a concept is categorial. We're not even told whether category is binary. Are there degrees of categoricity? What he does say about categories can be summed up surprisingly quickly, given their importance in his thought. Categories are conceptual kinds rather than straightforwardly ontological kinds. This is the move he thought Occam made and Kant followed him in, and that he picks up. Categories define the fundamental kinds of things in themselves only to the degree that the conceptual framework in which they function as high-level conceptual kinds is a fully adequate framework, one suitable for the Peircean endgame. Second point is that we can distinguish between formal and material categories, between determinable and determinate categories. And besides such formal categories as substance, quality, relation, we can include the modalities and state of affairs as formal categories with event and action as material categories under them. Now, beyond that, one of the most helpful things he does say is squirreled away in a lesser known essay, The Intentional Realism of Everett Hall. He does not directly say that Hall's philosophy is aimed at the discovery and analysis of categories, but he characterizes Hall, like Kant, as someone who rejects the idea that all knowledge is either analytic and a priori or synthetic and empirical. This third form of knowledge is denominated as categorial by Hall, and Sellars tells us, quote, the test of claim, back on this one. The test of claims falling within this third enterprise is to be found, quote, in the forms of everyday thought about everyday matters, insofar as these reveal commitment in some tacit way to a view or perhaps several views about how the world is made up, about its basic dimensions. We find, Hall continues, these forms of everyday thought chiefly in the grammatical structures, in a broad sense, of daily speech, in what may be called the resources of ordinary language, although they are also present in the ways in which we personally experience things. We need to take this description that Sellars gives us seriously because he goes on to say that, quote, this conception of philosophy is the truth to which both the descriptive phenomenology of Husserl and the conceptual analysis of the developing phase of Oxford philosophy are halting approximations. That's a pretty clear endorsement. Hall's methods won't, in Sellars' view, I think, uncover the finally ultimate categories as they would be developed in a fully adequate science, but it does tell us what to look for and a little bit of where to look in our analysis of the categories of the manifest image. Sellars tells us further that, quote, a fundamental question with respect to any conceptual framework is, of what sort are the basic objects of the framework? Sellars also tells us that we are approaching an answer to the question, what are the basic objects of the manifest image, when we say that it includes persons, animals, lower forms of life, and merely material things like rivers and stones. The list, he says, is not intended to be complete. He goes on to put a special emphasis on persons as the primary object kind of the manifest image. The other basic object kinds were hypothetically first understood as truncations or diminutions of the primary kind, persons, though they have since come to have a life of their own, as it were. Now, Sellars' non-exhaustive list of basic object kinds in the manifest image, persons, animals, lower forms of life, and I assume this includes not only plants, but such recent discoveries as bacteria and merely material things. Excuse me. That list might seem to be universal, a list shared across time, space, and cultures, but there are most certainly questions that can be raised about it. Are persons a disjoint class from animals, either actually or potentially, or is it a part of the manifest image that persons are animals? Is living thing a kind of supercategory, a determinable containing person, animal, and lower forms of life as determinate forms? Even at this highly abstract level, using the same categories, wouldn't it be important to differentiate possible relations among them? For the list of categories is almost certainly not an unordered list. Consider these two organizations of the categories. Intuitively, these seem, at least to me, to be very different conceptual frameworks, even though the list of the categories is in each identical. Coherence and thus inferentialist theories of concepts, in any case, have to say that these are different frameworks because there are different logical or semantic structures involved. So here's one way we might discover disunity within the manifest image. Despite apparent verbal disagreement, since the words, the lists are actually pretty much the same, merely as lists, the deeper inferential structures underlying the categories diverge. And a case has been made for both of these setups. What I've labeled CS1 is, of course, more Aristotelian and naturalistic. And Sellars does say, it should be clear that I regard Aristotle as the philosopher of the manifest image. CS2 is decidedly more Cartesian. It trades on the idea that the basic objects of the manifest image are persons and things where those are mutually exclusive. And there are echoes of that in Sellars and places too. So it isn't hard to see ways in which there might be disparate forms of the manifest image. Perhaps Sellars' tacit assumption that there is a manifest image is misleading. Maybe it's even seriously misleading. Sellars recognizes that the developments in the sciences have had an impact upon the manifest image, so there are temporarily distinctive forms the manifest image has taken, but he does not seem to consider whether there are or even have been, say, geographically distinctive forms of it. Perhaps the East-West divide reaches deeper than mere spatial distance. Resolving differences within the sciences is no easy matter. Defenders of the disunity of science hold that differences among the sciences cannot always be resolved. Can resolving differences within the manifest image be any easier? After all, the standards of evidence and inference in the manifest image are, if anything, less clear than they are in the sciences. Humans, for instance, have long endorsed the existence of such beings as angels, demons, ghosts, and spirits. Many still do. How are we contemporary philosophers to think about this? Either such beings belong in a category of their own, or they are determinate forms of the category person. Is someone who denies, especially one who categorically denies, the existence of angels and demons, ghosts, and spirits, operating in the same conceptual framework as someone who just takes it for granted that such ethereal beings exist and are regularly involved in the processes of the world? I'm very skeptical that this is a merely empirical disagreement. On to section 3, persons and the models of the basic. While the discussion of angels, demons, etc., foreshadows my destination, I've gotten ahead of myself a bit here. I've told you that persons are the primary objects of the manifest image, but I need to review for you what in Sellars' eyes counts as a person. In Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man, Sellars describes persons as items to which certain kinds of contrasts are applicable. The most important contrasts, he says, are those between actions which are expressions of character and actions which are not expressions of character on the one hand, and between habitual actions and deliberate actions on the other. Now, deliberation requires conceptual thought, and conceptual thought in turn involves the ability to evaluate. And he tells us further that, quote, anything which can properly be called conceptual thinking can occur only within a framework of conceptual thinking, in terms of which it can be criticized, supported, refuted, in short, evaluated. To be able to think is to be able to measure one's thoughts by standards of correctness, of relevance, of evidence. This is the ability to place things in a logical space of reasons that has been made so much of recently. So, person is primarily for Sellars a forensic category. Persons are primarily agents, accessible in terms of responsibilities and proprieties, or in random speak, commitments and entitlements. Early in PSIM, the emphasis seems to be on their epistemic agency, but by the end of the essay, it is clear that agency in general is the domain of persons. Persons are responsible for what they think and what they do. Things, even animals, are not. Let me note explicitly that the reflexivity in Sellars' formulation, that is, that it specifies the ability to measure one's own thoughts against standards, is deliberate and essential. After all, virtually anything can be measured against some standard, that is, some ought to be, it is a peculiarity of persons to be able to measure themselves against standards. Yet, this reflexive formulation also conceals an important complication, for it makes it sound as if the requisite forms of evaluation are all internal, that one need only worry about ensuring one's own measuring up to the relevant standards. And that's not his considered opinion. The point is one philosophers from Hegel to Wittgenstein to Brandom have made very clear. Any substantive notion of standards is essentially social. The reflexive ability to evaluate one's own thoughts against standards makes sense only in a context in which others as well, at least in principle, can also evaluate them. Standards against which one's thoughts, and we might as well add actions here too, are to be judged, are not just those of correctness, of relevance, of evidence. Surely they include just as well the standards of prudence, expedience, standards of etiquette, morality, and so forth. Sellars does eventually make this clear in PSIM. Quote, to think of a featherless biped as a person is to think of it as a being with which one is bound up in a network of rights and duties. To think of a featherless biped as a person is to construe its behavior in terms of actual or potential membership in an embracing group, each member of which thinks of itself as a member of the group. This emphasizes moral standards and other social norms above all. Persons, Sellars believes, will not be basic objects of the scientific image. Should we care? The concept of a person, and therefore persons themselves, will survive because the essential means of their normative constitution, the language of individual and community intentions, is indispensable and must be added to the scientific image. This leaves unanswered questions. If persons are no longer basic objects in the final dispensation, does that mean that person ceases to be a categorial concept and becomes, well, what? A merely empirical descriptor like feldspar or maybe can opener? But the language of personhood has its own special logic, rife with material implications that do not apply to, for instance, feldspar or river. Now, can opener, as denominating a class of artifacts, may implicate the special logic of personhood and agency, but it's not directly subject to it. If person, therefore, remains categorial, because inter alia, it involves an indispensable and grammatically distinctive form of language, how is it to fit in with the categorial scheme of the ultimately triumphant scientific image? Do these two categorial schemes simply coexist side by side? So let's think a bit more about what it means that persons are basic objects in the manifest image. Among other things, this means that persons are not conceived of in the manifest image as composed of some yet more basic kinds. Persons have parts, of course, arms, legs, hearts, kidneys, but those are not more basic than persons. How the merely material, whether earth, air, fire, and water, or the more fine-grained elements of the standard model, relates to persons is, as we've seen, open to interpretation in the manifest image. In the 17th century, one attempt to keep personhood basic and categorial in the face of materialist challenge was to opt for a straightforward idealism. I take it that's really no longer a live option, at least not that form of idealism. We can, however, make sense of the idea that persons are basic objects if we give up the idea that basic objects have to be that out of which other objects are built. Why think that in order to be basic, an object has to be such that while it can be part of the composition of other objects, it is not itself composed of other more basic objects? The atomic molecular model of the relation between the basic and the derivative or constructed tended to dominate the era of the early scientific revolution. Sellars knew it is not the only possible model, but I think it still dazzled Sellars and accounts for his continued espousal of logical atomism as the ideal ontological structure. But let's face it, it just doesn't get the conceptual structure of the manifest image right. And it is not clear to me that the arguments for abandoning the conception of the basic found in the manifest image are compelling. The clearest alternative to such an atomic molecular model of the relation between the basic and the dependent is an Aristotelian model in which basic objects are always individuals, but individuals, depending on their kind, are not always determined simply by their composition. For Aristotle, of course, some individuals are determined by their function. Sometimes, of course, this model agrees with the atomic molecular model. A rock is the individual it is, and the kind of individual it is, because of the adhesion of its particles, which accounts for its unity. But the unity of a living thing, and especially the unity of a person, is a more complex affair. The proximate parts of an animal, organs, appendages, etc., tend to stay the same, though some can be lost without destroying the individual. But the smaller parts at the micro level are changing fairly constantly. Organisms and persons are better conceived of on the more Aristotelian model, which privileges the whole over its parts. Why should we suppose that the ultimately acceptable conceptual framework is such that it employs only one kind of basic object-dependent object relation? A one-dimensional framework may be simpler, but the world is hardly a simple place. Sellars tells us several more things about the concept of a person. I've already quoted his claim that to think of a featherless biped as a person is to think of it as a being with which one is bound up in a network of rights and duties. But that insight he describes as a relatively superficial point. Later in PSIM, he tells us that, quote, a person can almost be defined as a being that has intentions. Well, why almost? One reason is that it seems obvious to anyone but the most convinced Cartesian that non-human animals can also have intentions. And while there are those willing to extend the realm of personhood to non-human and infralingual animals, neither Sellars nor I am willing to take that step. Sellars would grant that non-human animals can have intentions. What is important to personhood is the ability to have a certain kind of intention. Quote, thus, the conceptual framework of persons is the framework in which we think of one another as sharing the community intentions which provide the ambience of principles and standards, above all, those which make meaningful discourse and rationality itself possible, within which we live our own individual lives. This, of course, is still highly idealized and abstract, but it points us in an important direction. The crucial element constituting the realm of persons is the sharing of community intentions. It follows that to recognize a featherless biped or dolphin or Martian as a person requires that one think thoughts of the form, we, one, shall do or abstain from doing actions of kind A in circumstances of kind C. Now, Sellars seems quite liberal here, potentially including dolphins and Martians as persons. But the we who shares intentions has all too often been given a far narrower interpretation. Is it odd that pronomial use, the ability to say we, becomes a categorial marker? Can categories be perspectival? Sellars describes the idea that persons are the kinds of things that have rights and duties as relatively superficial. And the more basic point, quote, is the fact that to think of a featherless biped as a person is to construe its behavior in terms of actual or potential membership in an embracing group, each member of which thinks of itself as a member of the group. Let us call such a group a community. And he goes on to remark, essentially, that we cannot take the scope of the community for granted. Whoops. So he tells us that once the primitive tribe, it is currently almost the brotherhood of man and is potentially the republic of rational beings. Compare Kant's Kingdom of Ends. And here's the crack that I think we Sellarsians need to do more to excavate. Who are we? So part 3, persons as socially and normatively constituted. Let me run with the idea that as we continue to refine the scientific image, we neither dispose of the notion of a person nor demote it by impossibly, as far as I can see, insisting that everything said of persons and everything interesting about persons can, in real time and without expressive loss, be said in the descriptive vocabulary developed by the sciences. Suppose, for our purposes, that the manifest image distinguishes between persons and things, not in that persons and things are composed of different stuffs, but that what is important to their being the individuals they are depends on different kinds of considerations. Things are generally subject to the atom-molecule logic. What they are is determined by what they are made of and how it is structured. Furthermore, things are subject to rigorous patterns of behavior, often formulable in so-called natural laws. Having described some natural thing in such terms, says everything necessary about it. Persons, in contrast, do not fall under the strict atom-molecule logic. They have a material composition, but that's not actually what's important about them. Rather, persons are, as Sellars describes them, loci of responsibilities and proprieties. They are constituted by their position and activities within a social context regulated by norms of behavior. Each person in the society will be the locus of any number of responsibilities and proprieties, many of which come in bundles we think of as belonging to social roles. These responsibilities and proprieties will not be capable of expression in the descriptive languages of the sciences. They require expression in an irreducible sui generis form of language, the language of ought to be's and ought to do's. And that form of language is indispensable for the human or personal form of life. A person can be a parent, an employee, a citizen, a neighbor, a member of several distinct social organizations, etc. Each of these roles bundles a number of responsibilities and proprieties. Most of these roles, as well as the responsibilities and proprieties they include, are limited and fungible. They do not encompass the whole of the person's life and are only contingently related to any person who inhabits them. Notably, the roles inhabited by any one individual need not play nicely with each other. One person may occupy distinct roles that impose incompatible responsibilities or proprieties upon her. On such a view, persons remain basic objects. It also means that person remains a categorial concept in that framework because it is tied to a whole family of related concepts that we use to articulate important facets of how the world is made up and about its basic dimensions. These concepts, these forms of thought, are indeed reflected in the grammatical structures and resources of daily speech and personal experience. We've already mentioned some of these concepts, the notions of rights, duties, standards, a self, an intention, and especially, of course, shared or community intentions. So my fourth section is called, Are there determinables of the category person? Assuming then, for the moment, that we can preserve the concept of a person as our understanding of the world progresses, the next question is whether the categorial concept person is a determinable with a cast of determinates under it. And I want to suggest that the answer, insofar as it is concerned with the de facto status of this category, is both far from clear and terribly important. The concept of, okay, well, let's see. The concept of person is connected with the concept of a community, a group that shares some important intentions. But we surely would not want to say that each community a person belongs to constitutes a subcategory of persons. The Rotarians differ from the Lions and the Oddfellows. Red Sox Nation differs from the Evil Empire, but they're not categorical differences. However much Yankee fans differ from Red Sox fans, it's not in any metaphysically deep sense. I admit that. Mere differences in the rights and duties attributable to the members of different groups do not then rise to the level of categorial differences. German citizens have different rights and duties from American citizens, but again, they're not metaphysically significant or categorial. What differences might make a real categorial difference? Well, many of the roles we occupy are contingent, but not all. Some roles are inescapable and non-fungible. There is a set of responsibilities and proprieties that accrues to every moral agent as such. They are traditionally imputed to every person as such, and without regard to the other roles they may inhabit. There's argument about the exact ground and nature of such inescapable responsibilities and proprieties. Kant pins everything on one's status as a rational agent. Utilitarians, in contrast, on one's ability to feel and recognize in others pleasure and pain. Religions of the book forefront the existence of a God-given soul. The inferential structures embedding the concept of a person differ for these traditions, but choosing among them requires a careful investigation of how those inferential structures are to be further elaborated. Consider now then, for instance, the distinction between men and women. First of all, let me note that for the purposes of my talk, it is unclear whether this is a distinction of sex or gender. We've only begun recently to get clear on those differences. Second, my introductory remarks that the distinction intended to be I'm intending just to be sort of report. I don't want to endorse any particular way of construing this distinction. The distinction between men and women is marked grammatically, sometimes in several different ways, in all the natural languages I know of. Remember that this is one of the criteria of categoricity mentioned by Hall. It has also been freighted with significant differences in the relevant rights and duties and in the relevant expectations and proprieties. I think that there is a strong argument to be made that the distinction between men and women has, for millennia, delineated in common thought two different but basic dimensions of the social world. The received view of the distinction between man and woman takes it to support and justify systemic differences in the relative social positions and opportunities of people, as well as the appropriate forms of interaction among them. My colleague Charlotte Witt has developed the notion of a megasocial role, which she describes as, quote, the dominant normative element in our social lives, not as a discrete part, but as the role that is prior to our other social roles and that prioritizes, defines, and organizes all of them, unquote. And she has constructed a powerful argument that gender is just such a megasocial role. I think I can recruit those arguments to support the claim I want to make here. In the manifest image, as it has been constituted until very recently, the man-woman distinction is effectively categorial. As traditionally thought of, being a man is a distinctly different way of being a person from being a woman. There may be some abstract commonalities they share, such as generically having rights, duties, and social status, but the actual rights, duties, and status appropriate to each have differed significantly. The categoricity of the distinction means that it is unusually deeply embedded in the very structures of our thought, learned early and held tightly, even if only tacitly. As a categorial structure guiding the very forms of our thinking, it often goes unnoticed or at least unquestioned. And this means that attempts to weaken or undermine the significance of the distinction have a particularly steep hill to climb. For categorial distinctions are, as Everett Hall correctly saw, resistant, if not immune, to empirical refutation. They can, indeed often, be mistaken to be a priori, or at least so screamingly obvious that it is guaranteed independently of any evidence. Revising the categorial distinctions drawn within the social world entails a structural reconstitution of that world, and that is difficult. When it concerns the categories of personhood, it shakes one to the very core of one's being. And what is happening now, and I think the movement is far from being widespread, much less complete, is bringing the categoricity of the man-woman distinction into question. The difficulty many people have, not just with feminism, but with the notions of gender fluidity, the trans, and the non-binary, is not just a matter of ignoring the complicated facts about sex and sexuality, nor is it a simple failure to recognize the equality between the sexes, although both of those are in play. as long as the man, woman, or male, female distinction functions categorially for some, claims about equality and the social construction and malleability of gender roles will seem at best scholastic or simply beside the point. We might think of some analogies, the way arguments about the transubstantiation of the Eucharist seem to the unbeliever, or the way an argument over whose dress at the Oscars was the best or the worst seems to someone who thinks the whole shebang is a colossal boondoggle of capitalist distraction. While
5 minutes.
All right. While such reflections may garner a little sympathy for the conservative faced with the wrenching prospect of restructuring a framework on which they have built their life, I do not think these reflections justify such conservatism. My own pragmatist proclivities commit me to the belief that anything can be put into question. I think the category of persons will survive future developments, but I don't think the current conceptions of gender have any such stability. We have begun to free the notion of gender and gender roles from the biological notion of sex, and we are at the same time coming to realize that sexuality itself is far more complex in actual fact than traditional views allow for. How best to restructure our conceptions of sex and gender, if we preserve them at all, so that they no longer fuel oppressive or exploitative structures and activities remains to be worked out, I think. Perhaps we will abandon the idea that sex and gender roles are universally assignable, stable clusters that organize the responsibilities and proprieties each of us carry. This would, in an important sense, flatten and homogenize the landscape of personhood. If I'm right about this, then there is a pessimistic and an optimistic point to be made. The pessimistic point is that those for whom the distinctions of sex or gender function categorially, change will be very difficult. Arguments are unlikely to move them. Shifting the benefits and burdens allocated in society would probably help, but making such shifts without adjusting people's attitudes seems to generate a sort of chicken and egg problem. How do you make the shifts without changing the attitudes, and how do you change the attitudes without making the shifts? On the optimistic side, however, change is possible. Norms are human constructs. Significant change may take place only on the scale of generations, for younger generations are not as deeply tied to the older categories when they have been challenged for good cause. Perhaps we can think of this as one of the upsides of human mortality. There's a temptation to claim that the other concept so often paired with sex and gender in these modern disputations, namely race, is in a similar situation. It functions for too many people as a basic subcategory, dividing the class of persons in normatively significant ways that resist empirical justification. Now, I don't think the case is as easily made as the case with sex and gender. Race is not, as far as I can see, marked grammatically in our language. Clearly, there is racist language, but it's not built into the very grammar of the languages I know. While the distinctions between sexes and genders are ancient, recent investigations have argued that the notion of race is relatively recent in origin. So I don't think the claim that race functions as a category for many people is anywhere close to obvious. I also doubt that it's universal. I believe that there are societies and cultures in this world in which race is not socially significant. It is, very unfortunately, very socially significant here in the United States. So while race is not embedded in the grammar of English, American English, it can be notably present in the pragmatics of the language and the proprieties of social interaction. Use of the N-word is the most obvious case, but if you address a grown man as boy, it's hard not to decode what's going on there. So while I can't claim that race is simply a categorical feature of the current American conceptual framework, I do think that the analogy is worth taking seriously. Race should be thought of as at least a near category in the traditional reigning ideology in the United States. It operates slyly, often under the covers. People who sincerely and seriously intend nothing racist, who may even intend to live in anti-racist ways, may nonetheless find themselves falling into behaviors that perform racism because they're structured into this social milieu. It colors the way almost every American thinks and acts. That race is ultimately not a full categorical feature of our framework seems to bode well. Shouldn't that make it easier to overcome? I find it hard to be sanguine on this score. race was deeply embedded in the power and economic structure of American society, and groups very rarely surrender well-established power voluntarily, even if it is unjustifiably held. Isabel Wilkerson's recent book, Caste, is depressing in its account of the scope and pervasiveness of racist and casteist behavior. So my concluding unscientific remarks, I hope I can get them in. I do not have a big stirring conclusion to put before you. I have asked whether the manifest image is as unified as Sellars' admittedly abstract portrayal makes it seem, and I've pointed to several dimensions along which we could imagine different human communities developing different forms of what seems manifest to them. I proposed one way we could construe the relation between the manifest and the scientific images that would not demote personhood to a dispensable and merely empirical descriptive category. And I looked superficially, I admit, at gender and race as conceptions that subdivide the category of persons in deep ways resistant to change. Such categorial subdivisions of this category are potent threats to the ethical project because they make possible a serious disruption of the we, the shared intentionality that underlies all ethics. Sellars thinks that ethics is the attempt to formulate and deploy the shared categorially reasonable intentions of the most embracing community, where the most embracing community to which one belongs consists of those with whom one can enter into meaningful discourse. Thus, in Sellars' view, the crucial and indispensable aspect of the manifest image, the language of individual and community intentions, does possess a unique telos. It is to enable the most embracing community possible in the pursuit of its and its members' welfare. The human we, as Sellars remarks, was once the primitive tribe. It is currently almost the brotherhood of man and is potentially the republic of rational beings. We subdivide the category of person at our own peril. The manifest image is not static. Sellars thinks about how developments in the empirical sciences may induce changes in it, but we need to investigate more thoroughly how developments in philosophy, in axiology, and social consciousness are also an important source of change in the manifest image. Science may aim to know our world better, but ethics aims to make our world better. We, at least we Sellarsians, should take it even more seriously. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill.
Let me get out, stop the share here.
Okay,
All right, we're back.
great. Thank you. All right. So we have we have more than 20 minutes for questions. So we'll start with Aude.
Hey, Aude.
Hi. It feels like a family reunion. So
Yes.
it's great to see you. So thank you very much for this very intriguing talk, which addresses the issue of the meaning of the category of person. So I suggest that maybe we could see this category of person not as a substantial category, but rather as a methodological tool. And I guess that in the light of the works that have been made by Ian Hacking, for example, about making up people and social constructions, it seems to me that the category of person epitomizes what a socially constructed category is. And it is paradigmatic since, well, according to Searle's analysis, persons is both a subjective concept and yes, yet ontologically it is objective, just like the concept of money, but it remains a fundamental category since it is the origins of, I guess, all the looping effect that Ian Hacking theorizes in his work on social construction. So the category person provides all the roots and the means from which we somehow, as you mentioned in the beginning of philosophy and the scientific image of man, all the looping effect by which we come to become what we think we should be. And there is this, if I'm right, he makes this comparison with Spinoza. And of course, we would not be the same kind of people if we thought that we were deprived of free will of whatsoever. So I guess that the category person has both a methodological and a descriptive component as a philosophical operative concept, since as methodological, it accounts for the space of reasons and the normative, the normativity that is characteristic of the manifest image. But it is also embedded in the natural world as the concept or the category of person, depending on the content that you give it to it, can have causal effects and make us or make people up in that way. Is that clear?
I think so. I'm a little bit worried because when you say that a distinction or a certain category is methodological, particularly in a Sellarsian context, that's a way of, as it were, extracting it from the ontological, right? So consider, he thinks that the observation theoretical distinction is methodological. And that's a way of saying, well, it's not an ontological distinction. Don't expect that observable entities are ontologically any different on a different standing from theoretical entities. And so I'm a little bit worried that making person, as it were, emphasizing the methodology is saying that, well, so yeah, persons don't really exist. They're not really ontologically to be taken seriously. And I'm, as you can tell, trying hard to make some sense out of the idea that even though he is, terribly committed to the idea that science is the measure of what is that it is and what is not that it is not, still trying to find some way in which persons don't become ontologically nugatory. They don't really exist. And because if we don't really exist, then, once we recognize that we don't really exist, well, we do go poof and we cease to exist. So I want to find some way that the notion of person clearly has deep and important methodological, importance. Without the notion of a person, there's no such thing as a methodology. But I resist the idea that persons end up, that the notion of a person ends up being without any ontological oomph to it whatsoever, even though sometimes he says things that make it sound like that. But I sometimes he doesn't, and I want to try and find a way to allow persons to have some ontological status, even though they're not basic entities in science. Does that help?
Yeah, I would just, what would be the difference between the category of persons and the category of money, for example, to take Searle's favorite example? Because money does exist, but still it's a social construct.
Well, I think the way I'm proposing would ultimately have to accord, what you say, the sort of, it raises the question, well, what the hell is ontology anyway? And I must admit, I have been puzzled about what is ontological, what are the basic criteria for ontology in any case. And I guess I would like an ontology in which, yeah, it turns out to be important that money exists. And if you don't recognize that money exists, you're not in a good situation, at least in a capitalist society. If you don't recognize that persons exist, well, what are you doing? You're a thing. So I'm wondering if I don't think of the ontological enterprise in a different way from Sellars. And for a long time, I thought he understood all that perfectly well, or understood, his was the right way to think about it. I guess I'm not quite so sure anymore, in part because I'm not so sure what it is to do ontology. He had a set of convictions about it that I guess I'm not fully on board with anymore. What can I say? I'm drifting left wing. Something like that.
Jim?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I have a question, and maybe it chimes in with Ode's point in a different way, and would still be consistent maybe with what you're doing. So it's sort of a Pollyanna question. And that's within you nicely emphasize how the manifest image evolves and so on, and the perennial philosophy evolves in the way it makes sense of it. So one of the big ones he thinks is what Kant did with the I think and persons and agents. So it emerges from that the concept or category of a person isn't of a kind of object, strictly speaking. I mean, right. As Ode emphasized, it'll be related to the natural world in all kinds of ways. But that you get a very different notion. It ends up as ineliminable and basic as you want it to be, but it's not in the same atom, molecular, basic object. I know that in the structure of knowledge, he starts off with he says it's an Aristotelian picture of the manifest image, but as far as persons go, the Kantian successful next step in the perennial philosophy of the manifest image makes persons basic, but not basic objects in the same way that fits the constituent component picture. And
well, let me ask, what is, I mean, for them to be basic, but not basic objects? Right. What does that mean?
Well, that was Kant's insight, that persons can somehow be indispensable and irreducible without, in any picture of the world that's possible for us, but not as basic objects of perceptual response or whatever. So they end up being centers of rights and responsibility, the irreducibility of the normative, blah, blah, blah. But that ends up being, which I think links up with Ode's methodologically basic, but not in the way that you went with it. So that was a crucial move in the manifest image, and then it will end up doing a lot of the things that you want to do with how it could evolve and change. But it's a basic category of a certain center of rights and responsibilities and reactive attitudes and all that.
Okay, I guess, but that still ends up, I mean, or to what extent does that end up not agreeing that persons don't exist? Right? I mean, they're basic entities of this functional kind, but the functional kind is not an ontologically notable kind, right?
As you say, that links up with the whole difficult question of how, for him, it would be awkward and not really true to say meanings don't exist, people don't exist, norms don't exist. Right. So, but there's a big distinction in the ways that he tries to work out the irreducible fundamentality of the prescriptive personhood dimension and the fundamentality of which objects get to be basic in the other sense. I mean, that's got to be part of his view, even if it's hard to. I agree. It's hard, it's one of the big issues.
Yeah.
Still got a few questions, so maybe we should move on to Lionel.
Unmute yourself, Lionel. I'm still not hearing you.
Yeah, I think Lionel's having audio problems. Okay, so we'll move on to Preston, and maybe when Lionel rejoins, his audio will be fixed.
Good.
So I also want to circle back around to Al's point, and something she mentioned at the end, Bill, because I share the concern about how to place persons in a view where we take the scientific image seriously. But why not treat persons something like money? There's this stuff in social ontology about deontic powers that, in virtue of our adopting attitudes toward sheets of paper or shiny bits of metal, we invest these things with deontic powers, an ability to affect the world in certain ways, in virtue of the way we take them to have powers. And so why not treat persons like that? And presumably, even in the scientific image, there's going to be some kind of account of the attitudes that in a community are such as to make it the case that a shiny bit of metal counts as money. So there is a kind of indirect location of those deontic powers in the scientific image in virtue of the way they're set up and sustained by the attitudes of human beings. So why not treat persons as something like that? They're a kind of deontic power. They're a thing that is instituted in virtue of the attitudes of the people in a community, and think that that's enough to get persons on the scene in a kind of scientifically acceptable.
I thought I sort of agreed that they are in many ways parallel. What I guess I'm worried about is that I don't want to end up with a story on which persons turn out to be fictions. It's just, well, there's all this as if stuff. I don't want to make it a philosophy of as if. It seems to me that persons are as real as they make themselves be. Money is real. So the idea that they're, I guess I'm still worried about the bootstrapping part. It looks like, people pull themselves into existence by their own bootstraps, but you need to explain, or we need to have a story about how that establishes a reality, can establish a reality in a world in which, all that's going on are absolute processes buzzing and booming. And so it needs to be fleshed out a bit more because it looks like, we bootstrap money into existence by having the attitudes, but how did we bootstrap ourselves into existence by having attitudes until we were such as we already had attitudes, in which case we had to have already been attributing ourselves attitudes. I'm still troubled by that, and I think that's pushing me towards, as I said, reassessing my understanding of what the hell it is to do ontology.
Yeah.
Is that at least an adequate postponement of the issue?
I'm totally sympathetic to all that. I'll try to maybe address some of it in my talk tomorrow, because I do think that both the ontogeny and the phylogeny are important. We got to have a story about how we came to be as a species able to do that, and we need a story about how we do it as individuals. My own view is that there's a real categorial shift in what it is to be a person. It's not about describing the way the world is so that we're sort of passively receptive to facts, but it's an exercise of agency. We make it the case that money counts as something. We make it the case that we're people, and so we couldn't be wrong about it insofar as we choose to do it. It's got a different direction of fit or something like that.
Okay.
I think those are exactly the issues to address.
Okay, we have 2 hands left, and maybe if we're quick with questions and answers, we can get to both of them, hopefully, fingers crossed. So Lionel and Jonathan.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Bill. You were asking whether there could be or have been categorial revisions in the manifest image with regard to race, in the way that you were suggesting that there's an ongoing one in the case of sex or gender. One suggestion would be to look at something very Sellarsian, namely the distinction between common nouns and kind words and adjectives. And it does seem to me that there's been a shift there fairly recently, a move away from common nouns toward adjectives, often in modifying person or man or woman. Most recently, of course, things like enslaved person rather than slave. I mean, common nouns, other than perhaps for some occupational roles like blacksmith, are often considered slurs. Increasingly, at least in American English, less so in other languages, as those of you living in, say, Czechia will be well aware of. But I'm wondering whether that's something that might help your case, and something rather Sellarsian.
That'd be really interesting. I must admit I hadn't gotten that far as to think about it, but there is work on the logic of slurs and things like that, and that would be really interesting to pursue. That's a direction I have not gone, but sounds interesting.
I mean, people used to say, Chinaman and so forth.
Right.
And I mean, just to give an obvious example, you mentioned other ones. Right. It seems to be a general phenomenon worth looking at. Maybe.
Interesting. Yeah, good suggestion. Thanks.
Yeah, great. So I think we have time for Jonathan's question, and then we will wrap briefly for lunch.
Yes. Hello, Willem. I just was thinking, I'm very sympathetic with your resistance to the idea of sort of reducing person to some kind of functional or, I don't know, judicial kind of concept. But it struck me that a lot of the sort of drift of your talk was that nevertheless, the manifest image is not a kind of integral, unitary sort of thing. It struck me that if one wants to retain the idea of a kind of a natural metaphysical notion of a person as a sort of ontological category, if you will, then you're also going to have to probably, aren't you, accept that there's going to be a lot of the world of persons that is going to come along with those persons, although it's going to be no doubt a complicated and difficult matter to exactly determine what those categories are. It doesn't seem very likely that the only thing that will be retained in the world for us, as it were, will be us, and the rest of it could just be atoms in the void. I mean, they'll still be.
Right. I think that's right. And and
categories. I mean, it's not exactly a transcendental argument, but it just seems very unlikely that if persons persist, then other things that are part of that image will also persist.
Right. I mean, Sellars does, talk at one point as if we could, in formulating our intentions, ultimately start using the vocabulary of, advanced science, et cetera. And I must admit, that seems to me fairly wildly implausible, in that if the advanced sciences, are, quantum mechanics or its successor, trying to, explain, tell someone that you want a hammer, would you hand them the hammer? You're not going to be using the vocabulary of physics to do that. You're not going to be using the vocabulary of any particular science to do that, because there is no particular science of hammers. It's a useful designation for a useful tool, and we'll, as long as we are persons, we're not going to stop needing hammers or screwdrivers or whatever. So the idea that we're going to end up replacing the vocabulary, the manifest image, the descriptive vocabulary, the manifest image, with the descriptive vocabulary of the sciences, also seems to me wildly implausible, because there just isn't world enough in time to learn all that stuff, much less to say it. So, and then but then so what? He thinks, well, we could keep it on as a useful tool, our ordinary language, but it would have no ontological implications. But that sort of that leaves me unsettled, because if a language is, or a form of language is indispensable, well, you're committed to it in some sense. Shouldn't you take that commitment seriously? And particularly if your perceptual and agential intercourse with the world is in terms of those manifest image categories, manifest image predicates and descriptors. Maybe it means I don't think we will ever get to describe the world as it is in itself, as opposed to the world as it is for us. Maybe I'm more of a Kantian than Sellars is. I don't know. I've been thinking about this stuff for these 50 years, and I'm still puzzled.
Thanks.
Thank you for all the questions, and thank you so much, Bill. We really appreciate your talk.
Thank you all for coming and staying awake if you did. And I look forward to the rest of the conference.
Absolutely.